amid those fears of escalation, US President Joe Biden is set to visit Israel on Wednesday in a show of solidarity. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made that announcement after overnight talks with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Blinken said that they agreed to begin work on some kind of plan that could see aid allowed into Gaza.
The United States and Israel have agreed to develop a plan that will enable humanitarian aid from donor nations and multilateral organizations to reach civilians in Gaza, and them alone, including the possibility of creating areas to help keep civilians out of harm's way. It is critical that aid begin flowing into Gaza as soon as possible. We share Israel's concern that Hamas may seize or destroy aid entering Gaza or otherwise preventing it from reaching the people who need it. If Hamas in any way blocks humanitarian assistance from reaching civilians, including by seizing the aid itself, we'll be the first to condemn it, and we will work to prevent it from happening again.
Well, let's now speak to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, we know that Biden is about to be en route to Israel, if he isn't already. Talk us through his agenda there and what he hopes to achieve on this trip.
Yeah, the U.S. president set to depart early evening Washington time, so he's not yet left. He should be leaving about 6 hours or later. He's rarely on time. What we do know is that he is going to be meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and there are three goals that he has for that meeting. The first is to outline humanitarian assistance, to essentially make sure that there's a framework for that, to make sure that there's food, water, medicine getting in, and making sure that there's a safe passage for those that are trapped to get out, but that this doesn't allow or benefit Hamas at all. So that is one of the top priorities of this visit. The other is military support. The United States standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel and making no mistake about that, wants to make sure it's getting the support that it needs and working with Congress to do so. So finding some clarity on that, as well as getting an update on the pace of military operations, and as well finding an update on the hostages and how those, not only Americans, but also foreign nationals, can be reunited with their families. So that meeting will take place, and then concurrently, or rather right after that meeting, the U.S. president will be traveling to Jordan, where he will be meeting with King Abdullah. He will also be meeting with President Sisi and Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority.
Kimberly, as you and I are talking, we're watching smoke rise above Gaza City right now. As the civilian death toll in Gaza continues to mount, have you noticed any kind of a change in tone from the United States?
Well, there certainly has been a change in tone in terms of the priority of the humanitarian situation. The U.S. president on about a week ago insisted that the United States and Israel were complying with international law and making it a priority that they comply with international law, making this sort of moral distinction between itself and Hamas, except that there didn't seem to be any sort of moral distinction, given the fact that Israel was denying electricity, food, water, and the U.S. was supporting Israel in that and didn't seem to be making any sort of effort to hold Israel to account. But it seems in the last 24 hours, there seems to be a shift towards making the humanitarian effort a priority and ensuring that civilians get what they need. And so that would certainly be a marked shift compared to many days earlier.
Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett there for us. Thank you very much, Kimberly. And just to point out to our viewers, we are watching further airstrikes right now live on your screen. Well, let's now bring in Andrew Bacevich. He's a U.S. military historian. He also co-founded the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He joins us now from Walpole in Massachusetts. Mr. Bacevich, I want to start by asking you to reflect a little on the U.S. response over the last 10 days, both in terms of military mobilization and rhetoric. How closely aligned now are the U.S. and Israeli national security practices?
Not as closely aligned as they were 24 hours after this war began. I think that the shock felt by Israelis was matched by the shock of many Americans. And so the rhetoric we were hearing both from the Biden administration and from commentators basically mirrored the rhetoric from the Israelis, that Hamas was going to be destroyed, and there appeared to be very little concern about the negative consequences for the civilian residents of Gaza. It seems to me that now has substantially changed, and the humanitarian issue is moving quickly to the forefront.
Even as that happens, though, I believe Israel's National Security Advisor has said that he believes the U.S. will get involved if the war spreads, if we, for instance, see escalation on the Lebanese border, Iranian involvement. What's your assessment now of the Biden doctrine when it comes to the Middle East?
My impression is that despite what that spokesman said, that Israel does not want the United States to become militarily involved. Doing so would be a massive departure from the Israeli strategic tradition, which insists that Israel defends itself in all circumstances. Beyond that, I seriously doubt that Mr. Biden wants to become directly involved in the war. That is to say, putting American soldiers at risk, possibly sustaining U.S. casualties. He is that our country is now well into an election campaign. Recent American wars have not gone well, have not benefited incumbents. I'm referring to Iraq and Afghanistan primarily. And therefore, from a political calculus, I would say that the last thing the Biden administration wants is to get the U.S. in another shooting war.
I want to ask you a little bit about your writing, because in the past you've said that the inhabitants of Gaza and the occupied West Bank could only annoy Israel and not do it serious harm. Do you think that's changed? And has harm already been done, even if it's been only to the perception of Israel as being invulnerable?
Yeah, if I wrote that, it was wrong, because the Hamas attack has clearly indicated capabilities to do damage to Israel that are far beyond what I think most observers expected. Now, that doesn't mean that Hamas has the capability of overrunning Israel or of really winning a war with the IDF, but they have demonstrated capabilities and determination that have done tremendous harm to Israel, and one suspects that Hamas has the capability to do more of the same again.
I want to ask you a little bit about the rhetoric that you mentioned there. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks in Israel and at the start of this war, because the rhetoric that was used then has had consequences. 4 years ago, you said, and I'm sorry to quote you back to yourself, it's not been permissible to have an honest conversation about the US-Israeli relationship and about Israeli policies. To insist on having that honest conversation is to invite punishment. Do you feel that way in the US today?
Oh, I think there's no doubt about it. And the Hamas terror attack has made it that much more difficult for Americans to take any kind of a balanced view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To do so is to be painted an appeaser, to be painted an apologist for Hamas, and therefore what I think is necessary, which is to take seriously the history of this conflict and how it has evolved, that is off the table. And that is one of the reasons why it's going to be that much more difficult to come to a reasoned peace once this war is finally over.
You speak about a reasoned peace. Do you think what we're seeing unfold now potentially could provide an opportunity to make different choices going forward, perhaps even reinvigorate some kind of an engagement with a new peace process?
Well, I would like to answer your question in the affirmative. I would like to say that this can pave the way for some kind of arrangement that would enable Palestinians and Israelis to live together in peace. I think the likelihood of that happening is close to nil. Now, that said, there are moments in history when war brings about substantial and indeed positive political change. In a sense, I think we saw an example of that in the wake of the '73 war, which led to peace between Israel and Egypt. So in theory, that's possible. As a practical matter, I don't see the leadership on either side of this conflict that is going to make that kind of a deal possible.
Andrew Bacevich there, a U.S. military historian and a co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Really great to get your thoughts here on Al Jazeera. Mr. Bacevich, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.